bum. Bum 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 bum. Da da da. Everybody, sing along. Bum bum bum. Bum 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 bum. It's hard to sing along when there are no words, and the melody I make up every time differently. But sing along anyway. Bum 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 bum. And now, it's time for a simultaneous sip. Coffee with Scott Adams. It's the best kind of coffee. Mmm. All right, so before 1,000 people ask me the same question, and I know what the question is, did Twitter reduce your follower count? Were you part of the what people imagine is some kind of conservative purge? And might be. I just don't have facts yet. So let me tell you. Let me look at my follower count and I will tell you the answer to that question. So I have the same number of followers, as far as I can tell, as yesterday. So it doesn't look as though the Twitter purge had an effect on me that I could notice. You know, in other words, if a few dozen people were kicked off of my followers, I wouldn't notice. But certainly no big kind of change in my account. Now, the fact that they went down should not be alarming by itself, because some number of these are illegitimate accounts. So it is routine that every now and then they would get rid of the illegitimate accounts. If they're getting rid of legitimate accounts, some of that might be a mistake. In other words, their algorithm might be picking up too many people. But I wouldn't worry about it until you know details. All right, I'm going to talk about a couple of different topics. I want to talk about some of the worst gun arguments I'm hearing. So it doesn't matter which side of the gun argument you're on. These are just bad arguments. All right. So if you are either pro-gun or anti-gun, don't use any of these arguments. And I keep seeing these in social media. There are good arguments on both sides of this issue. There really are. That's why it's such a problematic issue, is that the arguments on both sides are pretty good. You know, it's good that you want to protect children. That's good. And, you know, and restricting guns might do something about that. And it's good that we have a Second Amendment and people can own guns. That's good too. So we have plenty of good arguments about guns. But here are the bad ones, all right? I'm just going to run through them. One is that limiting bump stocks won't make any difference, because I saw that YouTube once where somebody used his belt loop to loop, I don't know, the trigger or whatever you do, and the belt loop sort of imitated a machine gun for a little while at a shooting range. Let me tell you, probably there will never be a mass shooter who uses his belt loop during the event, because the belt loop is not exactly a reliable method of mass murder. You know, take, for example, the Florida shooter. The Florida shooter did not have a bump stock, but he probably did have a loop on his pants, and he didn't use it because it wouldn't have helped him. It would have been a distraction. It probably takes a little setting up. You probably have to sort of look down and make sure you're doing it right. Doesn't aim very well. Yeah, and rubber bands do the same thing. So my observation is that any friction you introduce into gun ownership causes even the bad people to adjust their method. So how many mass murders have you seen using fully automatic weapons since they were banned in 1986? Can you think of any? I think from the time that automatic weapons were banned, we haven't seen one. The ban actually worked. And I would say the fact that we are seeing AR-15s used in Vegas and now this other attack in Florida, it's because that's the best weapon they can get a hold of. If you made them harder to get a hold of, they would go down to the next best weapon as well. So we do know that introducing friction makes a difference. Right? Whoever's saying 3D printing, I'm going to add that to my list of bad arguments. So the people saying, well, you could just 3D print a bump stock, for example, or someday 3D print your own gun. Here's the thing. Very few mass shooters are going to go 3D print a gun, partly because they're not capable, and partly by the time you have that much wherewithal and capability, you probably have other interests other than murdering people. You know, the lonely loser doesn't have $20,000 worth of 3D printing stuff and instructions and know-how and all that. So while it is technically true that 3D printing could create a weapon that could be used in a mass murder, the amount of friction to get there is a lot, and that makes a difference. All right. Another bad argument I'm hearing is that handguns are more dangerous than AR-15s. Dumb argument. It depends on the situation. If what you need to do is conceal your weapon, handgun's pretty good. If what you need to do is shoot people from a distance, such as the Las Vegas shooter, handguns would not have been the weapon of choice. So to say that a handgun is better than an AR-15 is dumb, because it just depends on your situation. There clearly are situations where the rifle is going to be better than the handgun and vice versa. So it just depends on the situation. And in the case of the Vegas shooter, my understanding is that because of his age, he couldn't get a handgun because he wasn't old enough, but he could get an AR-15. So in that case, the handgun was not more dangerous, even though it might have done a lot of damage in the school. So that's another bad argument. Another argument is if you make guns illegal, only the bad guys will get guns. True-ish, but it's also false-ish. Professional criminals will probably get guns. I think that's true. But they're not the school shooters. You know, the school shooters are kind of going to go through legal means because they tend not to be criminals. So that the people who flip out and decide to shoot a bunch of people are not career criminals, and if they needed to do a lot of work to get an illegal gun, they'd have to produce a lot of cash. That would raise suspicions. You know, like if let's say you're a teenager, you know, how do you get thousands of dollars worth of cash? You know, there are a lot of flags that would be raised in the trying to get a deadly weapon. So I would say that reducing guns would create more friction on the type of people who do these mass murders. It doesn't eliminate it. There's the Second Amendment argument, which is, hey, it's in the Second Amendment, so that's the end of the story. No, that's a bad argument, because the Constitution is built so that we can change it when we need to. So if the Constitution is no longer serving us, we should reinterpret it with the Supreme Court, which I know you don't love, but it's an option. We could change it, right? So the Constitution allows that you can change it if you have enough support. But just saying it's in the Second Amendment, therefore it's good, that's not thinking. Thinking would be, it's in the Second Amendment, and now looking at it from 2018 perspective, I still think it's a good idea and it still should be in the Second Amendment. Now that would be a good argument. But to say that hundreds of years ago, people who had never seen the internet or automatic weapons made a rule and therefore it's binding on us forever, that doesn't make any sense for a rule that we can change. So the question is not whether it's in the Constitution or not. The question is, should it be in 2018? In other words, should it be revisited? Personally, I think it belongs in the Constitution and should not be revisited. But it's not an argument just to say it's in the Constitution. All right, that's not an argument. Here's some other bad gun arguments. Somebody said, why does it make sense? It's crazy, somebody said, I just read this, that the shooter could buy an AR-15 at age 18, I guess, in Florida, but he couldn't get a handgun until age 21. And somebody said, why does that make sense? You know, these AR-15s are worse than handguns. Well, as we previously discussed, whether or not they're worse depends on the situation you're going to use it for. Handguns are easier to hide, as somebody just said. So there are situations where handguns would be way worse for somebody to get a hold of when they're 18. Way worse. Because they could just have it with them all the time. And then they flip out and it's like, hey, well, I got a handgun, I'm going to use it. Whereas a rifle requires some concealment, some planning. You're not going to carry it with you everywhere. So if you flip out, you don't have a gun with you. You know, it's back at home and you'd have to sort of work at getting it. So it does make sense that there's a difference in age between handguns and AR-15s, but you could argue that the AR-15 should also be age 21. That'd be a reasonable argument. Another argument is that the more guns you have in the country, the more murder there is. But if you look at countries and murder rates and weapon ownership, it's just not true. The number of guns is not perfectly coordinated, perfectly correlated with the amount of deaths. There are plenty of countries that don't have many guns, but they have plenty of murder. So there are other factors. The number of gun ownership is certainly a variable, and an important one. But there are lots of other variables that determine whether a country is more or less murderous. The economic situation is one of them. Some people say gun control doesn't work. I would argue that we've seen it work. That is to say, the very first thing I said was the ban on automatic weapons seems to have kept automatic weapons away from people. And these mass murderers certainly would have used automatic weapons if they were available, because they're far better killing machines. They're just way better. And then somebody said that the Florida shooter situation is not a gun control problem. It was an FBI failure problem. So the idea here is that, forget about talking about the guns, because that guy wouldn't have had a gun if the FBI had done its job and, they'd done everything they needed to do. I would say that is not a reasonable argument. It's true, but it's not reasonable. Meaning that it's true that if the FBI had done their job, there's a good chance this wouldn't have happened in Florida, the Florida shooting. But it's also true that if he didn't have a gun, the FBI wouldn't have had to do anything. So it can be true that the FBI maybe was the people we blame the most, but it's not true it's the only variable. He had to not only have a gun, but the FBI also had to fail. So there are two variables. If either one of them had been changed, it wouldn't have happened. If he hadn't had a gun, it wouldn't have happened, at least not the way it did, etc. All right. Now, the second topic, so those are the bad arguments. Don't use the bad arguments because there are plenty of good arguments for and against gun ownership. How many of you noticed that I posted a blog, an actually written blog? I wrote a blog post. So if you haven't seen that, you might go check that. And the title is, What If the News Reported Only Facts? We've lost sight of the fact that the news is mostly an opinion vehicle. In the old days, the news gave you the facts, and it was very, very expensive to go out and do the research and get the facts. Now, some of those facts might have been wrong, and of course there was maybe a little bit of opinion snuck in there. But mostly the news was about facts, as best they could get them. These days, the economics of the news is that it's very cheap to have somebody come on for free and give you their opinion. I'm a good example of that. So I'm a person who has appeared on CNN and Fox News and CNBC because I'm free. and I just go down and I give my opinions. So opinions are very inexpensive. News is expensive. So the model of the business media, the news media, is that they move to mostly opinion with a little bit of news to seed the opinions. So in that situation, I say to myself, what would things look like today if the news had been actually just news? So I give some examples where the news could have been reported just factually compared to what I call the mind-reading news. Now, if you look at the news today, or what passes as news, it's mostly opinion, and a lot of that opinion is what I call mind-reading opinion. So the mind-reading part is people say, well, because the president did this or that, he's a racist. But the racist part is not based on what he did. The racist part is what you imagine he's thinking, which is different. And indeed, even the courts recently did some mind reading. You remember the president's first immigration proposals was shot down by the court because the court said that based on the president's other things that had nothing to do with immigration, his other statements during the campaign, that they believed his thoughts were impure around the subject of immigration. The courts actually decided that they could read the president's mind, and they had determined that the reason he had made his policy the way he did is that his internal thought process was racism. That's crazy, right? Things are either legal or not, they're either part of his job or not, but to imagine that you can read the mind of the person doing it is a little dangerous. Now, of course, you do have to do some mind reading if somebody commits a crime. You've got to say, did they have motive? But in the context of news, it's not so good. All right, so let me give you some examples of what the news would look like if it was just reported straight without the opinion. So remember the birtherism thing about Trump. Here's how the birtherism thing could have been reported if it was just facts. Factual report. Donald Trump exploited doubts within the Republican base about President Obama's birth certificate to gain a political advantage. This is a common political tactic. Candidate Trump used the same strategy against Ted Cruz, who was born in Canada, but is an American citizen. All right, so you heard that. That was just all a bunch of facts. That he used the birther thing because it was available to him. It's a common strategy. Here's how the mind readers report it. So this is the mind reading version of the same story. So the mind reading version is, we can read Trump's inner racist mind, and we know the real reason he was involved with birtherism is to send a silent dog whistle to the racist in the Republican Party. See the difference? The facts do not support the mind reading. They're just not connected. Now, one does not disprove the other. So in other words, you haven't proven that he's not thinking this. You're just saying that he could be thinking this. Let me give you another one where the facts would be different from the mind reading. So remember the original statement that the president made when he was running, when he announced his candidacy. He said that some Mexican illegal immigrants were rapists and murderers, and some he assumed were good people. Here would be the factual way to report that. Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president with a speech in which he noted that some illegal immigrants from Mexico are criminals. That's it. Those are the facts. He noted that some immigrants are criminals. Here's the mind-reading version of that same story. Candidate Trump secretly believes all Mexicans are rapists. We know that to be true because he said some illegal immigrants from Mexico he assumes are good people. That is a clear sign that he is thinking no one from Mexico is a good person, even though some is not an indication of percentage. So the mind readers see a bunch of stuff there that the facts do not present. Take Charlottesville, same thing. If it had been factually reported, it would look like this. President Trump said there were, quote, fine people on both sides of the Charlottesville protests. When asked to clarify if that meant the racists with tiki tortures were fine people, the president clarified that he disavowed that group and was talking about non-racists who might have been there to support keeping historical Civil War statues that many believe are offensive. Excuse me. The mind-reading version of that, which is not in evidence, would be this, and this is the way it was reported. Even though President Trump clarified that he disavows the racists, we can read his inner thoughts, and it is clear he thinks racists are the fine people because he knows he is one. That's not in evidence. That's mind reading. Look at the KKK disavowal. You remember when Jake Tapper was interviewing Trump. So a factual report would have looked like this. In a CNN interview with Jake Tapper, candidate Trump did not take the opportunity Tapper repeatedly gave him to denounce the KKK and David Duke. President Trump said later that he had some audio problems and didn't hear the question properly. He clarified the next day that he does disavow the KKK and David Duke, and he has several times in the past. Right? Those are all the facts that we have. We have no other facts. Here's the mind-reading version. President Trump is secretly fond of the KKK and David Duke, and he was sending a secret dog whistle to racists. That's why he refused to disavow them until he was badgered into it. But his disavowals were dishonest because he secretly supports them. None of that is in evidence. All right? The facts don't indicate that. That's pure mind reading. Let's take the Judge Curiel example. Here are the facts that are in evidence and could have been reported this way. Candidate Trump employed a common legal strategy by questioning the objectivity of the judge for the Trump University trial. The strategy was a solid one because it biased the judge to rule favorably for Trump to avoid the appearance of bias. As it turned out, the judge scheduled the trial for after the election, which was unnecessarily generous to Trump. A more normal schedule would have put the trial before election. The potential bias Trump called out was that because of his immigration plan, Trump was deeply unpopular with Americans of Mexican heritage. Lawyers routinely consider that sort of potential bias. All right? So those would be the facts. Here's the mind-reading version of it that we got instead. Trump is racist against people with Mexican heritage and believes they can't be good judges. Nothing like that is in fact. That is pure mind reading. All right? There's nothing like that ever happened, but that's the way it was reported. Let's take the shithole countries situation. A factual reporting of it would look like this. In a non-public meeting with other politicians, President Trump used strong language, shithole countries, to question why our immigration policies allow in so many people from economically disadvantaged countries instead of economically advanced countries such as Norway. That's what happened. Now here's the mind-reading version. President Trump called black and brown countries shitholes because he's a racist. That's not in evidence. That is mind-reading. It's imagining what he's thinking. So, and here's the thing. I could do this all day long, and you would find that almost all of the real stories have a mind-reading version, which is what you see most of the time on the news. But here's the net of this. The net of this is that if the news had not told voters that President Trump is a racist, in their opinion, of course, would the public think so? Let me say it again. If the news, and this would include, I suppose, social media operatives, but if the news had not told people their impression that all of these things mean the president is a racist, would the public have seen it based on the facts? In other words, would the public independently have looked at the birtherism situation and said to themselves, oh, when you question somebody's birth status, that's racist? I don't think so. I don't think the public would have concluded that. If you had heard that the president said some people at Charlottesville were fine people, but when asked to clarify, he said, no, I don't mean the racists. I thought there were some other people there protesting, just they wanted to keep the historical statues. If it had been reported that way, would the public say, oh, I think he really, in his mind, he likes those racists? I don't think so. I think the news would have said, we wondered what he meant by this, and then he clarified it. And he clarified it exactly the way you would expect him to clarify it. Of course I'm not defending racists. That's the way he clarified it. And you can go right down the line. So here's my take on this. The anti-Trump media is reporting that this giant Hitler racist guy got elected. And, it's a big problem. But they made this. This is something that the president's policies do not scream racism. Obviously with immigration, 100% of the things you can do with immigration, if you change it, no matter what direction you change it, any kind of change has a racial outcome. So you could always say that all immigration policies are racist because they all have an outcome that either favors or doesn't favor certain countries, and most countries have a certain composition. So it's easy to turn any immigration policy into racism, but it's not there in the facts. The facts are that countries can be discriminated against for immigration, and the trouble is that most of those countries are made up of a majority of one kind of person. But that doesn't change the fact that it's the president's job to discriminate against countries. That's his job. We elect him to do that. So I would argue that the media has created this Trump monster in the minds of the electorate, and it's one of the probably most effective persuasion games I've ever seen. Because half of the country, maybe more, literally believes that all of the things I just talked about are clear signs of racism, when none of that is present in the facts. The facts just don't have any of that. And it's been a year now, and we haven't seen any racist policies by the president. The closest thing that comes to that was the Muslim ban, but that got tweaked. The courts got involved. The president said, "Oh, I'll respect what the courts say. I'll alter it until it's acceptable," which he did. That's very not Hitler. Somebody says, "Connect the dots, Scott. It's not hard." Well, I recognize you from being a Twitter troll. So connect the dots. It's not hard. You are actually favoring the mind-reading method instead of the facts, because you're so sure that if you look at all these breadcrumbs, you can see something. But I would argue that you would not see any of that, except the media has primed you to see it. So whoever primes you with the frame, this is the way to look at this, it's hard to lose that. And once the media has said, yes, the president is a big old racist, once they've primed you with that, everything he does, you're reminded of that frame, that priming. So the person who said, "Connect the dots, Scott, it's not hard, look at all these clues," you are clearly suffering some kind of confirmation bias situation here. Clearly. Central Park 5. Here's how Central Park 5 could have been reported factually. 5 people were accused of a heinous crime. Donald Trump wrote a full-page ad agreeing with the police that these people were probably guilty, and he said that, they should be executed or something. That would be, so I just gave you the factual report. Was it important that the 5 people were black? Well, Trump didn't mention their color. The police didn't mention their color, except in describing, I suppose, who they were. But race was not part of the question. It wasn't what the police didn't arrest them because they were black. Trump didn't run the article, the full-page ad, because they were black. In other words, that's not in evidence. Again, I don't want to read his mind. I'm telling you that whoever said, well, what about the Central Park Five? Well, clearly you are reading Trump's mind, or you believe you can, if you think that the real secret reason was racism. It was just a terrible crime. President Trump is very much against this Florida shooter, right? So much so that he's actually considering changing gun laws because of it. But we're not talking about the shooter's race because he's, somebody said off-white. Oh yeah, let's talk about Sam Harris. So Sam Harris interviewed somebody whose name I always thought was Niall, but Sam pronounced it Neil Ferguson. I think he's a Harvard professor, historian, political commentator, one of the smarter, more noted intellectuals about politics and history in the world. So is the proper pronunciation Niall or Neil? Can anybody clear that up for me? I always thought it was Niall, but Sam said Neil, so it is Neil. Okay. Well, okay, I'm getting different answers here. So it is pronounced Neil. Okay. So Neil Ferguson went on Sam Harrison's podcast and answered some, talked about the Trump situation. And Sam said it was the first time that anybody had made him question his stance on Trump. Now, he said that in his tweet. I don't think he said that during the interview. So I listened to the interview, and I was looking for what were the parts that Sam responded to. And I don't know exactly, so I don't want to speak for him, but I'll tell you some of the key points of what Neil pointed out. He used the word counterfactual. And Neil pointed out that if you think things are horrible with this President Trump situation, you can't analyze that in a vacuum. In other words, you have to say, how would things have been if we had gotten President Clinton? And in particular, if we had imagined that the election was fixed and we had a President Trump and Republicans saying that the election had been fixed and everything's bad, would we be in a better situation today than we are with President Trump? And that's, Sam acted like that was a sort of novel's the wrong word, but a fresh way of looking at the situation, which sort of blew my mind because my background, as opposed to science, my background is economics. And if you have a background in economics or business, you reflexively, automatically compare everything to the alternative. So I've never not done that. I've always said, what would it look like compared to the alternative all the time? That's in top of mind for me all the time. So hearing Sam say that was not novel and not new, but fresh way to look at the President Trump situation was a little bit mind-blowing because I didn't realize anybody wasn't doing that. But I'm sure it's true because not everybody thinks in economic terms about the opportunity cost versus the choice. And you see the same thing with climate change, by the way. Sam is a pro-climate change type person, and one of my biggest arguments or criticisms of that position is that it's not being accurately compared to the alternatives. So the counterfactual, the alternative, what if you don't spend $1 trillion remediating and instead wait and just get better technology and then remediate? So that would be one alternative. There are other ones. So that's the counterfactual, or the what would you be doing if you weren't doing the thing you're doing, has always got to be top of mind. So it was amazing to me that that was even a point of conversation. I didn't even know that was worth talking about. I thought it was just automatic the way people think, but I think I'm wrong about that. The other thing that Neil said that sounded like Sam was hearing it for the first time was that the way to look at Trump was not as a fascist, but that he more closely fit the populist description. Now, I don't have a perfect memory of talking to Sam, but I think I said the same thing. If anybody remembers my interview, did I not say that he wasn't a fascist, he was a populist? I feel like I said the same thing. But here's the big difference. In the context of that conversation, I don't have any credibility, meaning I'm not a historian, I'm not the expert on fascism, I'm not the expert on populism. So people are confirming that I did clarify that I thought Trump was a populist and not a fascist. But the difference is I don't have any credibility to make that claim. You know, in the context of talking to Sam, I'm not a historian, and I'm not the one to say whether somebody more closely fits the model of history this way or not. But Neil is. So when this Harvard-trained, highly credible, much published author, historian says, now he's not very close to being a fascist, he's actually really close to populist. He's like a classic populist. I can almost feel Sam's brain breaking, because the claim that Trump is a fascist is really central to a lot of the criticism. And to hear one of the most qualified people in the country who could make this simple factual determination, which is, are what we're seeing from Trump look more like a fascist or more like a populist? And Neil was unequivocal. Oh, that's populist. That's not that fascist thing at all. It's populist. I felt like that might have been the moment that Sam started reconsidering his positions. But let me be a little more interesting about this. All right, so here's the interesting part. When I talked to Sam, those of you who heard my interview with him, Sam Harris, you probably thought to yourself, because most of you watching this podcast are, more biased toward me than him, you probably thought, and many of you said, my God, your arguments were so good. You tore him apart. You dismantled him. Now, you should know that 100% of the people who have the opposite bias, the people who are sort of Sam Harris fans and not pro-Trump, thought exactly the opposite thing happened. They thought that Sam dismantled me and showed me to be an unethical weasel. So we're seeing the two movies on one screen happening here. But here was my take on the interview. My take on the interview is that I did not convince Sam of anything. In other words, I persuaded nothing. There was not one persuasive thing I said during that interview that persuaded him during the interview. But that's not how it works. Here's the fun part. I walked away from that interview saying to myself, I don't know if I said it out loud, I don't think I ever did, but to myself I said, you're right, I reframed him. So he had a second frame to compare to the one he was using. But the frame I gave him was sort of unpopulated. It was just, I described it, but it didn't persuade him. It was just like this empty, unpopulated other way to look at the world. Now, his own was fully populated, and so that obviously would be his preference. But what I knew, based on my experience with persuasion, is that having created that second frame, it wasn't going to go away. And that over time, it would start to get populated with little observations. And that frame would start to fill out a little bit just automatically, based on stuff coming in. And I believe Let me give you some examples. So the fact that we've gone so long without an actual Hitler thing happening, at least in my opinion, no Hitler-like thing happening, that probably filled out my frame a little bit. When we saw Trump getting a little bit more bipartisan, or at least trying to be, at least trying to reach across to the Democrats a few times, that probably made my frame a little stickier. And there were a number of things, like the success with the tax plan, for example, that even if you didn't like it, even if you thought it was a bad idea, it looked successful. So that filled out my frame a little bit, all right? But it wasn't until Neil, who came in there with tons of credibility, the credibility I did not bring to the conversation, that when he said, no, he's not even close to this is my interpretation. He said he's not. He said Trump doesn't fit the fascist mold. He fits the populist mold. I felt like that was the point that the frame I had created started to hold. In other words, it's not nearly as big as the frame he has still. I mean, that's going to be hard to shake. But I do believe that there is a cumulative effect that once the frame is set, it starts to pick up confirmation as you go. I feel like I'm babbling too long today. What if he just dismissed you because you weren't intellectual enough and he ignored them? Well, I think there's a credibility component, yes. So I do believe that my opinions were more dismissed because I have less intellectual academic credibility, but that's not a criticism. You should discount people who don't have the credentials. So if Sam was discounting my opinion for lack of credentials, I'm not going to criticize that. That would be reasonable. Sam does not think you're in his class. Correct. Well, I'm not in his academic, intellectual, scientific class. I would recognize that myself. There are a number of people, I don't need to name them, but there are plenty of folks who are on a whole different level of, historical, political, scientific knowledge than me. Is Omarosa Trump's biggest mistake? Nah, not even close. Will my frame start popping up everywhere now? Well, my frame is already popping up everywhere. I would say my frame is pretty strong right now. Deep State is planning to accuse POTUS of having an affair with White House staff. I was kind of waiting for that, weren't you? I was just assuming that those kinds of rumors would be popping up. Have you been able to resist VR addiction? Yes, but not for the good reason. So some of you know I got a VR computer. So it's a computer that's optimized specifically. It's a regular computer, but it's got more memory and stuff for using a VR headset. So I'm using the Vive, V-I-V-E headset on a Microsoft Windows computer. And it comes with all these various programs and things. The reason I have not become addicted to it is that it only works perhaps one time out of 7. So of all the times, the many hours I've spent attempting to use it, the number of times there was actually like a VR environment and I could see it with my glasses and the menus worked and stuff, so far only once. And a couple times I've seen like a room, but I couldn't do anything in it. I was just standing in a room. So I would say the state of the technology is like the very first cell phones that were like the size of a brick. And, they would drop every call and you'd like, hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't have any signal. So so most of the time, I would say certainly 95% of all the time I've spent with the VR computer was just trying to make it work. And it's all different reasons. It's like something got locked up, something wasn't downloaded, there's a thing that's not charged, for some reason the cable stopped working, but it works if you put it in the other slot. And so you have an infinite number of very small things that can go wrong and do go wrong basically every time. So making it actually work once is very, very hard. I don't recommend buying it at all. I mean, not even a little bit. But where did I find my glasses? At my just lens crafter. Is there a cure for TDS? Yes, bipartisanship. Bipartisanship is the cure for TDS, but it requires Democrats to play along. Oh, I lost them the other day because it turns out that Christina's glasses, when she's not wearing her glasses, she thinks these look just like her glasses. So she had picked them up and moved them somewhere. And I hadn't talked to her yet. What is TDS? It is Trump Derangement Syndrome. How can Democrats and Republicans both win? There's a story on Chris Cuomo. Huh. What is the name of the guy Sam talked to? It was Neil Ferguson, and of Harvard, a historian, but Neil is spelled Niall, I think. All right. Are there any other topics of the day? Anything else you need cleared up? I'll go back to the question, what would be a win-win for both Republicans and Democrats? So the trick is, in a negotiation, you want both sides to be able to claim victory. So I'll just give you one easy example. Right now, President Trump wants $25 billion for a wall. Democrats say, well, we like border security a little bit, but we don't like a wall the whole way. So the Democrats could say, for example, this is just an example. He could say, we'll give you $25 billion, but we're not going to specify it's for a wall, it's just for border security. Spend it however you want. Then the president goes and spends it however he wants. Some of it's wall, some of it's human, some of it's electronic. And then the president says, I got my wall. Here it is. Here's a picture of my wall. But of course, it would not be the entire span, and they would still be building it for a few years. He'd say, look, it's a wall. I got my wall. And the Democrats could say, we didn't give him a wall. We gave him a budget. Some places wall makes sense, and we have walls there. Maybe we need a better wall. But basically, all we funded was border security. So you need these situations where both sides can spin it as a win. Mexicans say, here's my rope and ladder. I would be surprised if the rope and ladder works as well as you think it does. I do think it would be hilarious to have let's say an obstacle course that involves the wall and have people try to get over it as quickly as they can. I think you'd find out that it's not quite as easy as you think. Yeah, it is certainly completely practical to do it. But remember, when people go over the wall, they're bringing kids, women. Not everybody is an Olympic athlete. So getting over that wall isn't going to be easy. Drudge says Trump approval is at 48%. Is that something new? Let's see. Let's see what Drudge says. I assume that's a headline today. Well, we're talking about Billy Graham. Died at 99. That's pretty good. Oh, so Drudge is talking about Tavis Smiley sues PBS for firing over harassment allegations. Did I tell you my Tavis Smiley story? So Tavis Smiley, African-American host of the Tavis Smiley show, I guess, on PBS. And he got fired for alleged sexual harassment. Now, I appeared on his show as I was doing my book tour for How to Fail at Almost Everything. He enjoyed my book so much that he wanted me on, and I talked about it. So here I had the strangest experience going to the studio. So it was Tavis Smiley's staff. And I was greeted by, there are always producers and helpers and assistants and stuff running around. So there's always a lot of staff running around. By far, Tavis Smiley had the most beautiful staff I've ever seen. It was unusual. It was sort of, I was sort of laughing because it did not look to me as if they had been randomly hired. It looked like the hiring process involved some kind of a special look. But it was mostly women, or at least maybe just the ones I remembered. But there was a large percentage of women on his staff, and they were just unusually beautiful, just crazy beautiful. Yeah, like model beautiful. And I remember leaving there thinking, my God, how is there not trouble here? Why do you laugh at everything? Usually because I'm thinking of something funny. How's your book doing? Did it meet expectations? The book is, it made the New York Times bestseller list when it first came out. It is not on the bestseller list now, so obviously it could have done better, but it's been hugely influential. Did I enjoy recording the audio version of the book? I enjoyed that I could do it because most of you know I lost the ability to speak for a number of years. So just the ability to record it myself was a big deal to me, just in terms of my life. But it's not fun because you're reading a book out loud for hours and hours and hours. It's not fun at all. So there's some stories about the kid. His name is Hogg, H-O-G-G, who people are saying is what they call him, a crisis actor. I don't believe he's a crisis actor. And there's a video of a CNN producer coaching him for his on-air appearance. Now, what I should tell you, if you're not aware of this, is that it's actually completely normal for the producer of a news program to coach somebody who's not a professional. So when the professionals come on, they just come on and do their thing, the regular pundits. But if somebody like me gets invited to be on a show, for example, when I was on Bill Maher's show, the producers, they'll call you several times before you show up. After you show up, they'll meet with you more than once, more than one producer sometimes, and they'll say, this is the topic, these are the sorts of things, we imagine you'll say, tell us what you might say about this. So in other words, there is something called a pre-interview that's very normal. And it is also normal if you have a rookie, like this kid, who's not experienced being on camera, that you would prime him a little bit. You would get a sense for what you think he wants to say, and you probably would put some words in his mouth. but it's not as evil as it sounds, right? CNN is not putting words in his mouth, I don't believe, to further an agenda. They're putting words in his mouth so that he looks good on camera. So when CNN helps him figure out what he's going to say and works with him and says, do this and do that, it's not as nefarious as it sounds. It's more along the lines of making the kid look good, feel good, feel that he did a good job on camera, and still say the things that he wants to say. Now, did they give him some phrases that he would not have come up with on his own because he's a kid? Probably. But did the kid say something that was different from what he wanted to say in essence? No. No, I think the kid said what the kid wanted to say, and if CNN helped him say it well, including giving him some phrases or some points of view, as long as they were consistent with his own point of view, that's not as evil as it sounds. It's actually pretty normal. It's normal business. I wouldn't make a big thing about that. Why is he present at multiple locations? I don't believe that's true. I think you'll find that that's just not true. Now, if it's true that he's been involved in more than one situation, having seen him on camera, I just saw him this morning, I would say he's unusually comfortable and good at this video stuff. So good, I'd be surprised if he doesn't do something like this when he's older. So it should not be surprising if he's been on camera more than once, because he does have the personality and the chops to do that. So he is unusually ambitious. Well, I'll tell you, from just the brief clip I saw of that Hogg kid on camera, he's really good, right? Really, really good. So if you were that good at that age, yeah, you're going somewhere. He's got a future, and it might be politics. I wouldn't be surprised. I would think, he could actually take advantage of this experience to leverage his way into politics when he's old enough. His dad was FBI, but I don't know how much to make out of that. Yeah. All right, that's enough for now. I'm going to sign off and do some other stuff. I will talk to you.